If we can get actual leadership that believes in progress in policing and the evolution of policing, 21st century policing, Isaac, I promise you, we'd have a whole different nation, and it wouldn't even take that long.
So a few months ago, my wife and I were in an Uber, and the Uber driver was listening to NPR. And while we were driving through Philadelphia, heard on the radio an interview with this guy named Edwin Raymond. And it was captivating. He was a former New York City police officer who was a whistleblower. He was somebody who had gone into the police force hoping to change it from the inside out, and it ended up becoming somebody who wrote an entire book about why that task felt impossible and some of the obstacles that he ran into as a cop in New York. Edwin, to me, seems like a genuinely thoughtful person who is looking for a solution to some of the biggest problems we all read about with policing, especially in urban areas all across the United States. So I was thrilled to have him come on the show. I love this interview. I thought he was super interesting, super compelling guy. I'm excited to share his story with you, and I hope you get something out of it that is helpful, thought-provoking, and maybe spur some ideas about kind of work you can do in your local community to address some of the issues that many of us are concerned about. So without further ado, Edwin Raymond. Edwin Raymond, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Definitely, Isaac, anytime.
So, I'd like to start with maybe getting a little bit of background about you. I mean, your story now has become pretty widely known, but I'm sure there are going to be some listeners of mine who don't know your story. And maybe we can start with you joining the New York City Police Department. Can you talk a little bit about why you joined the NYPD and kind of what your motivation was behind, what motivation was behind becoming a police officer for you?
Absolutely. So I started having negative interactions with police at about 15 years old. And after about 3 years of this, I made the decision to get a look from the inside. So at 18 years old, I basically made the decision that when I'm of age, I will join the New York City Police Department to get a first-hand perspective, first-person view of what goes on, why it happens, and most importantly, what can be done to change it. And I ended up becoming a cop at 22 years old.
And so you're 22, you're joining the police force. What was that like for you? I mean, what were some of your initial impressions when you became a cop? And maybe tell us a little bit about your upbringing, where you grew up and how that kind of interacted with the early days of you being a police officer.
So I was born and raised in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, in the mid-'80s. Grew up in the '90s. My parents were immigrants from Haiti. Unfortunately, my mother died when I was only 3 years old. My dad wasn't working from the time I was about 6. So we were pretty poor, and the entire community was growing immigrant community, mostly from the Caribbean, and there was a lot of crime in those days. This is the late '80s, early '90s. The so-called crack epidemic, and all of the thousands of homicides and burglaries. You name it. It was a very different New York City. It was a very different nation at the time, and those were my building blocks. That's what I was raised around. But despite the surrounding, I walked a very straight line. But again, that did not stop the police harassment that started at about age 15. So in the police academy, one of the things that stood out was overwhelmingly white males, like overwhelmingly. And, many of them were great guys, friends that I have to this day. But I was also alarmed because many of them just had no idea what the city was like. They were from the suburbs. It was this relationship where you live out in the suburbs with a white picket fence and the American flag, in front of your home, but you drive, at least 20 miles to work into a completely different world that you're just completely ignorant to. But that's essentially, that was the pattern that I saw. One of the first things that stood out.
So early on in your experience as an officer, when you first get out to the streets, what are the interactions like for you? I mean, in your mind, what are you hoping to accomplish, and how do you feel like that's coming to fruition or not coming to fruition in the early days of your time as a police officer?
Well, I try to be the officer that I wish officers were to me. I worked hard, to let the people know that I'm one of you. Don't let this uniform fool you. I am from the community. I understand. I've been on the receiving ends of the system. I know what it's like, and I'm not here to do that. It was, I looked really young. I was 22. I looked really young at the time. So it was a little easier for me to interact with young folks and even older folks who thought I was much younger than I was. And for the most part, it was, the community saw and felt the difference. But there were also times where, because of the guidance of my supervisors, I was in situations that I would rather not be in. I got both ends of it. Some saw me as forever traitor, and some embraced the idea that someone like me is in the uniform.
Yeah, so I'm curious to hear more about that, I guess, because from, and I don't want to give away too much of your story before we get there, but I think we can say what happens as your time in NYPD evolves is that you start to see a lot of things that are very obviously broken to you. So maybe you could talk a little bit about when things for you started to feel like they were really, really off inside the NYPD, or what kinds of early signs you saw where you thought maybe I'm not going to be able to do the things I want to do or be the cop I want to be because of how this system is built.
Well, Isaac, one of the first things that actually shocked me was after 6 months of training in the police academy, I couldn't pinpoint what about the training led to the harassment that I know that I felt. I still was left with more questions. But then immediately after finishing the police academy and going out there on regular patrol, my colleagues and I were giving enforcement quotas. We were given enforcement quotas, and it was a trifecta. There were arrests, summonses, tickets, and stop and frisk. And every month we had to produce a certain amount of those three things. And there were serious repercussions if you didn't. And at first I assumed I'm a rookie. I'm in a rookie unit. They want us to get our feet wet. They want us to kind of know what the job is like. So they give us these quotas so we can essentially force the situation so that when it happens organically, we'll know what paperwork to do, how to do the paperwork, how to do our jobs. But then I saw that it was relentless. Every single day, the numbers game never let up. And then and then I started seeing what colleagues from the police academy were doing. People that I knew, people that I ate lunch with, people that for 6 months, we were in this journey together in training to become law enforcement. I knew many of them weren't bad people, but I didn't recognize them when they were policing. So I felt comfortable enough to ask them, hey, what was that out there? And everything went back to the numbers. And that's when I realized, Isaac, it's all about those numbers. And it's not equal at all. These numbers, you can't police white parts of New York City like this. This is something that is reserved for Black and brown communities.
Tell me a little bit about what kind of numbers we're talking about or what those quotas were around. Was it specific kinds of arrests that you were being asked to make, or was it that you had to hit certain numbers? I'd love to hear a little bit of the details about kind of how this played out in practice.
Sure. So there are specialized units where it's a little bit more about the quality of the arrest, but for the most part, it was quantity. You just had to get the numbers. And specifically broken windows enforcement, right? Quality of life, meaning the most minor things you can think of. The things that I've seen people arrested for. One gentleman bit into a jelly donut, and the hole that you insert the jelly from, the jelly spewed out of, and he was arrested for littering. Someone's phone was dying, and there was a socket in the subway station, and he charged his phone. He was arrested for theft of service for using the electricity of the subway system. Someone's phone started ringing. It was a ringtone, and he was arrested for sound reproduction, as if he had a boombox in the train station. And I'm watching all of this, and I'm saying, wow, And the officers are just trying to meet their numbers. They didn't sign up to arrest people all day for minor things, blocking the turnstile. There was a young couple where the young lady was taking the train, the young man wasn't, but so he stayed with her at the turnstile until her train came, like teenagers do. And he was arrested for blocking the turnstile, like you name it. And again, this is reserved for certain demographics. Everyone doesn't get this treatment.
That's it's kind of hard to wrap my head around, somebody being arrested for spilling jelly donut on the ground. I mean, was there a way for you to record these incidents? Was there, did you ever feel an opening to kind of push back on what you're seeing happening in real time? Or was it sort of like over time you started, trying to document some of the things that you were seeing?
Well, I was frustrated because, again, when we weren't out on patrol, when we'd hang out after work or sometimes during work at downtimes, I would question my colleagues, question their mentalities. And what I found was most people were just trying to pay their bills. They weren't thinking about all this stuff. And some of them, the way that they rationalized was, well, it is technically illegal. So it's not me. I'm just enforcing the law. If you don't like the law, go to your legislator. Like they would rationalize and tell themselves whatever they need to sleep at night. But, I always looked at the bigger picture and I was disgusted, especially because when people are being treated this way, when that person sees me, they don't know there's a difference. They just see the same uniform, essentially the same entity that temporarily took away their freedom for something so innocuous,
So time goes on, you're spending time in the force, and then the big thing happens, which I think, now is what you're very known for. And for those of you, or for those listeners who aren't familiar with your story, you started recording these interactions you're having with superior officers all the way up to kind of the top brass, the highest officers in NYPD. Those recordings turned into a New York Times Magazine piece. That piece, I think, has turned into a book since then called An Inconvenient Cop. And your story has also translated into lawsuits, along with I think 11 other officers of color that are alleging that supervising officers encourage cops to meet arrest quotas and the policy targeted people of color. So talk to me a little bit about that kind of pivot. It seems like you hit a point where it was like, there's no going back. I'm not going to be able to change this by just being a good cop or advocating inside the force. And you decided to do something, pretty drastic that led to all this kind of national recognition. I'd love to hear about your thought process through that and kind of what that experience was like when you started recording these interactions and really documenting what you were seeing.
So the original objective was to get into the police department, rise to the ranks to the point that I'm in charge of my own precinct, my own command, and do things differently, creating a template that could be replicated throughout the city. But I was forced to become an activist. I was forced to become the whistleblower because simply from speaking out within and refusing to go along with the flow, I suffered terrible retaliation. And at the time, early in my career, we had the stop and frisk federal lawsuit, which was gaining a lot of media attention. And I watched it closely. And there were several incidents where officers who testified against the city thankfully recorded interactions, which saved them because had they not had it recorded, they would have made a claim. The police department leaders would have made another claim. And, that's it. There's no evidence to corroborate it. So it wasn't an easy decision. It's not something that I enjoyed, but, I made the decision to record. I didn't know where it was going. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew that if things ever went south, these recordings, it'd be better to have them than not. And that's when I made the decision. And at first it'd be at roll call. The supervisor would give us our assignments. And when he got to me, he'd give the assignment, then he'll say, stand by after roll call, meaning I got to talk to you. I already knew what that meant. That was pressure and harassment and retaliation for not meeting enforcement quotas. And I wouldn't budge. I kept recording. I didn't budge. And eventually higher middle management started getting involved. I recorded them. I recorded my commander, and then I scored very well on the civil service exam to be promoted to sergeant. Out of 932 who passed the exam, I was number 8 on the list. And I think the first group that was promoted, what they do is they call a certain amount of people in at a time to go back to the Academy for Leadership Training. I think the first group was 44. I'm number 8. I'm supposed to be in that group, but I was skipped over. And it's called the Career Advancement Review Board. Basically, if there's a red flag when it's time to be promoted, you go before the board, you make your claim, and they take a vote as to whether or not they're going to promote you despite whatever the red flag was. So when I went before the 3 very high-ranking chiefs, I recorded that also, and again, not something that I enjoyed, but I had to protect myself, and I had to get it on record what's really going on in the police department.
So what happened in that meeting? I mean, what did the police chiefs tell you during that conversation, and how does it kind of fit into your larger story?
So there were 3 chiefs there. One was the chief of personnel, the person in charge of personnel. He chairs the meeting, and the other 2 chiefs there was like a rotation of chiefs that sat in on these meetings, on these review boards. One chief actually tried to make an argument that my evaluations don't reflect the person they see sitting in front of them. That's essentially what my commander did. He used the evaluation system to try to justify on paper why I shouldn't be promoted. But again, one chief immediately saw that this is not adding up, and if this doesn't add up, then who's to say that this evaluation is credible? Unfortunately, the other 2 chiefs, they were focused on what was on paper, and I made my argument. I said, I'm out here to do a job, a good job, the right way. I have no problem taking enforcement action, but I will never do it to meet an arbitrary number. It has to make sense. And technically, the more innocuous the infraction, the wider the range of discretion, theoretically, right? The more nonsense the infraction is, the more room I have as a cop to give a warning. And I gave warnings. And I know the system doesn't recognize or respect or honor warnings, but I'm not going to compromise who I am and the way that I see best to do my job to meet this number, even at great cost to myself. And unfortunately, I wasn't promoted right away. It would take a second meeting. And between those 2 meetings, the Times article came out. So they weren't happy. That they knew I'd recorded them, and they weren't happy about that. Yeah.
So, I know the response that came from the community. I mean, I was living in New York City at the time this story came out, and I think generally your story has shed light on a lot of the problems people see with policing in cities like New York. And I think, from the general public and the population that lives in New York, there was a lot of support for you and a lot of recognition that, sort of what you were highlighting was important. I'm curious what the reaction was like among your fellow colleagues. I mean, you mentioned the police chiefs, but there's also, hundreds, thousands of officers who you work side by side with every day. What was the response from them to your story? And are there other officers out there like you who sort of share this disdain for the quota and the numbers and those kinds of targets that kind of put this pressure on you guys?
Great question. In mentally preparing for the Times article to come out, knowing that, not knowing where things would go, but anticipating different directions, I was ready to be the rat, the snitch. I was ready for all of it. I honestly was ready for them to try to even harm me physically. But the one thing I never prepared for, and one thing I never anticipated, was the support. And don't get me wrong, to many, I was the snitch and the rat and all those things that I had anticipated. But that first day walking into work after the Times article came out, I came out on the day that I was off. So I kind of had a day to relax. So I didn't know what I was walking into the next morning. But when I walked in, the very first officer that saw me shook my hand and said, "Thank you. Thank you for speaking for us." I didn't expect that. I was like, oh, wow, okay, I didn't expect that. But then even the higher ranking officers who benefit greatly from those numbers, it affects their promotions. They started calling and thanking me. And then people I didn't even realize still had my phone number started calling me and thanking me. And so what I found, the response has been what I expected, which is, you rat, you piece of shit, you snitch. There were those that are indifferent. It doesn't make a difference in their lives. They have bills to pay and kids to raise, and that's their focus. But then there are those who genuinely feel that they're spoken for. Even some were chiefs. But then something phenomenal started occurring because I started doing news and panels, and more my story was getting out there. And officers from other jurisdictions started calling, started finding my email, contacting me on social media, calling officers that they know that work in New York to get my number. And that I never anticipated also. And I'd say nearly 3,000 officers in the last 8 years around the nation have reached out and said thank you. Other lawsuits, me and the 11 in the NYPD, we started a lawsuit. We're known to the media as the NYPD 12. In Prince George's County, 13 cops got together. They call them the PG-13. They got together and mirrored our lawsuit and won their lawsuit. And, all around the nation, officers were inspired. There was a documentary that came out called Crime and Punishment that essentially captured our fight. It gives a good crash course in my fight. And that kind of went viral in Copland. And officers saw it. They thought we were crazy. But when they went back into work, some of them, they just could not blindly go along anymore. So that's been the journey. Inspiration, a little, some backlash and indifference.
We're talking a lot about kind of how the system's broken and what's wrong and your experience on the inside. You no longer work at the NYPD. You've taken on this kind of new role as an activist and an author. This lawsuit has happened. I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about what we can do to improve the system, sort of the change element, what you're advocating for now, not just what you're advocating against. Because I think that's a piece of this story that a lot of people are hungry for. They know maybe something's broken. They know maybe it doesn't work. Where are those lines for you? I mean, what kind of basic reforms do you feel like a police department like the NYPD could take on that would be transformative for these communities?
Yeah, great question. So, and I'll answer this even broader than just the NYPD. Policing is not a monolith. Like, different jurisdictions have different ways of doing things. I mean, the similarities are there. Of course, it's an enforcement unit. It's an enforcement agency. So you're going to have the similarities. But every jurisdiction, again, functions differently. And I think one of the biggest disservices in this argument about policing, which I would say started about 10 years ago with Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, all of that happening in the same year in close proximity. We don't, and I guess because part of it is rooted in cynicism, we don't seek out the justice-minded law enforcement. People like me, again, are most people going to risk everything that they've worked so hard for, possibly risk their lives for something so much bigger than them? Probably not. But I'm not exclusive in how I think when it comes to being able to identify the issues and the detriments and wanting to do something about it. If we were to first find and then empower the justice-minded law enforcement officials throughout the nation, then we will get a different, I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe this thing, that we can get this right. We would get completely different policing system in the United States if we were to put the right people in the right positions. And that looks differently throughout the nation. But most importantly, as a society, we have to create the safety net so that speaking out isn't career suicide. We have to create an environment where we encourage the justice-minded to surface and help them rise to the top. Once we get that type of leadership that incentivizes the change, not the type of leadership where they're forced to implement changes that come from consent decrees and review boards and legislation and litigation, but deep inside and culturally they disagree with. we have to move away from that. If we can get actual leadership that believes in progress in policing and the evolution of policing, 21st century policing, Isaac, I promise you, we'd have a whole different nation, and it wouldn't even take that long. But that's what we need to do overall. Now, specifically for the NYPD, it's the same thing. We need the right leadership, but we need the right people joining police departments. One of the things that's happened since 2020, that the becoming a police officer was always kind of frowned upon, right? You're no longer the cool guy in the room. But it's far worse since 2020. And what happens is the right people with the right mentality, with the right integrity, we need them in that uniform more than anything, because the position doesn't disappear just because they don't apply. Someone that probably won't benefit society as much instead fills that position. So it's one of the biggest mistakes we have made by demonizing the very idea of law enforcement to the point where good people won't even apply. We can't do it that way. I get the abolition battle cry. I get it, believe me. But theoretically speaking, if we were to arrive to a society where police would be so minimally needed that we can possibly just get rid of them, the first step to getting to that society is not actually abolishing the cops. That's not the first step, right? The resources and everything else that we need. So there's a new normal in our nation. We have to get those steps aligned, but I don't want to suppress the idea of a society where cops aren't necessarily needed. But again, for the abolition folks out there, that's not the first step, right? And also the idea that cops have no positive function in society, that is another stretch. That's not realistic either. The objective is to cut the cancer out, not, get rid of the whole thing, at least not yet, given where the inequality that exists in our society socioeconomically and amongst other categories. We're not at a position yet in the United States and most nations where we can do something like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is such an interesting time, I think, because, we're 3 or 4 years out from the sort of that transformative summer around George Floyd's murder and all the kind of centering of a lot of these police issues and the Black Lives Matter movement and stuff. And I mean, just in the last few weeks, I've seen, in my work in the news that Washington, D.C. has brought back, some harsher penalizations for kind of lower level criminal offenses. Portland, Oregon, they've reversed course on their, drug decriminalization. In New York, we now have National Guard members patrolling the subway, which is totally wild. It seems like there's this kind of a reversal of some of the policies that were implemented then that are happening now. And, I think there's also a layer of this that's always been there that's very interesting, which is, there's a lot of sort of educated white progressives who advocate for, certain positions around policing, like abolishing the police or, removing police from communities. And they're often in tension with a lot of the lower income families who are actually living this stuff in these cities and areas where policing has a lot of issues. I'd be curious to kind of hear your thoughts about this moment in time right now and what you think activists should be focusing on in order to sort of win the argument about where policing should go next. I mean, you sort of alluded to it a little bit there, like, there needs to be some level of patience or understanding of the role police have in society, and we can't just go to this kind of abolition movement. But it does feel like we're at a really big tension kind of pivot point right now where things are going back almost to where they were before 2020.
Great points. And, the thing to highlight in all of that is it's not that we've changed elected officials. It's the same typically left-leaning Democrat elected officials that 4 years ago were saying one thing that are saying the complete opposite now, or at least showing that they're willing to be a little bit more conservative. And the reason why that keeps happening, Isaac, is because the pendulum keeps going way too far each time, right? And that will continue to be the case. Every time conservatives are in charge, they're going to go very old school and antiquated in the police response, in addressing public safety. And oftentimes when the liberals are in control, they're going to lean super left. And then based on the statistics, especially during an election year, you'll see them kind of lean a little bit more towards the right. We will continue having that pendulum swing until we get the justice-minded in the room. The justice-minded can bring the balance where we can have optimal public safety without violating civil rights. Because, again, when the liberals are in charge, they're more focused on the civil rights aspect of things, not really taking into consideration the public safety. And when conservatives are involved, they're hyper-focused on law and order, public safety, to the point where they're willing to violate civil rights. Again, the middle ground, if you will, the justice-minded is the answer. And because what that looks like in New York City, it might not look the same in Chicago or Oregon or Arizona. This is why we have to, again, identify the officers, the law enforcement officials in those respective jurisdictions, empower them, and we will get the right direction. Because hypothetically, had Mayor de Blasio back in 2020 recruited me in a task force, I would have advocated for the things that I know don't help with public safety, alienate the police department from the community, right? We would have fixed those things, but then we would have focused on other things. For instance, here in New York, right, people want to blame bail reform and raise the age where the age of criminal justice, of criminal responsibility is now 18 instead of 16. They want to blame those things for crime going in the wrong direction. But one thing that we don't have in New York that we should have, could and should have, is some sort of intervention in between arrest. There was a young man who was caught with a firearm in March of 2021. He was let go with a court date. He was caught with another firearm in May of 2021. He was let go with a court date. In August of 2021, he took someone's life. So now he's running for homicide at 16 years old. January of 2022, he turned 17, and days after his birthday, he kills someone else, right? The following week, he gets arrested. The detectives get him. We got him twice with a gun, Isaac, and yet there was no intervention, just a court date. For a 16-year-old that's obviously involved in everything he shouldn't be, and we end up with 2 homicides. The fact that we have no type of intervention, no redirection, that would help with crime in ways that, even would surprise me. Because when and it's funny because the police department has the data, they have the statistics. Most crimes, most serious crimes, it's actually a very small age group that does it. It's between ages 15 and about 23 years old, right? But when they get arrested for minor things, for major things, there's no intervention. That is something that we can invest in that would continue to reverberate positively for generations. But little things like that is something that, there are groups that advocate for that, but then they don't have answers for other things. And we can't keep going so far. The pendulum cannot keep swinging so far.
I'd love to pull maybe 1 or 2 more ideas out of you kind of in that vein. I mean, let's take the hypothetical. Edwin Raymond is, police chief in April of 2024, and you walk into the job with ideas about what to do based on your experiences in New York City specifically. And I think, it's really smart. And I love that you call out that, New York it should not serve as a monolith for what every police department should do. The police departments are not a monolith. But putting that aside for a moment, specific to New York City where you have experience, what kinds of policies or what policy direction might you prioritize based on sort of what you've experienced and seen?
Sure. So one of the things that's most detrimental to public safety and civil rights is broken windows policing, right? The idea that you over-enforce innocuous things in the belief that it will stop the larger things, right? There's a psychological deterrent claim and the whole teach you a lesson thing, because if we don't let you get away with the small things, you won't think about doing the bigger things. If there is any benefit to addressing smaller things, I don't necessarily want to lose that. I don't want to ignore the smaller things, but I don't think we should come with a sledgehammer. So one thing that I think New York City and many jurisdictions are lacking is an official warning system where if someone does something minor, the officer doesn't have to destroy their lives. The officer doesn't have to give them a summons and arrest them. You can give them a warning, a fair warning, and document it. If there's a change of behavior, great. Lesson learned, great rapport, good relationship, the changed behavior. If the behavior continues, there's documentation to show that, all right, you were caught speeding twice in the last 3 months. You obviously not learning your lesson. I'm going to take it up to enforcement. Here goes the summons. Isaac, that shows a level of care, a level of respect, a level of grace, right? That will go so far, because the person will be like, wow, that cop's not, a cop could have been a dick about it and he wasn't, or she wasn't. Let me slow down, or whatever the infraction, let me not drink outside, or whatever the infraction is. That way we still get essentially the broken windows response without having to just dismantle people's freedoms and lives, right? So that's one thing that New York City is missing. I think it's a way of addressing innocuous things, again, without being too egregious in how we do it. Little things like that can go so far, people have no idea. Again, focusing on putting the right people in the right positions. In having to fill seats, I've seen it. And one of the rare times that I'll quote and agree with former Commissioner Bratton, in his first book, he said, you can seriously undermine any organization by putting the right people in the wrong positions. The inverse of that is also true. You can also undermine organizations by putting the wrong people in the right positions. And too many times the appointments done is based on cronyism and nepotism, and not anything innovative, not anything that's going to take us in the 21st century policing. So that's one of the things I would immediately implement if I was in charge. An official warning system that allows our officers to engage, but keep a level of respect. Because again, the more innocuous the infraction, the wider the range that the discretion should be.
So I guess before we get out of here, I'm curious to hear a little bit about what's next for you. This book has come out. You're kind of in this activist mode. Are there any thoughts about rejoining the police force? Would that even be possible for you? Where do you feel like you're going to be able to make the most impact? I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of the road ahead in your eyes.
So this wasn't, leaving the police department was not an easy decision. I retired 5 years earlier than the minimum amount of time to start collecting my pension. So there's a financial sacrifice that I've made. But I realized that I have to take this fight to a national scale. Over nearly 3,000 officers reaching out. I can't ignore that. Officers need help. They need someone to speak for them. And I believe I'm the best to do it. When I joined the police department, I have the credentials and the experience to be appointed to leadership. So if there's a jurisdiction out there that sees me as an asset and offers me such a position, I would be open to it. So technically, yes, I could go back to being a cop, but not in the same way. I can't go back to being Lieutenant Raymond in the New York City Police Department, unfortunately. I left in order to do this from a different platform, and that's what I'm working on. I can't telegraph all the punches, but I'm working on something huge this August. I'm working on something huge to really take this conversation where it needs to go. I think it's about time that people understand that justice-minded officers exist, and we are ready to get into the right seats and move this in the right direction so that it can be something that's left to museums and history books. We can finally move on from the way that policing is done in this country.
All right, Edwin Raymond, he is the author of An Inconvenient Cop. Edwin, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'll be back anytime you need.